I'd like to start a little differently today. So I would like you to take a minute to think about what is music to you and to think about what does it mean for you to play music.
We just found an instrument which seems very interesting. We discover some music and we just want to have fun with it. That's a little bit my answer. The fun in playing
Yeah,
new
when you say
music.
it's about fun, like, and if you have like some highly spectral music, so where's the fun in that for you?
The fun to, especially when you're playing new music, I think it's the fun of giving the chance to the audience to learn about music, to be confronted with other ways of, like we say, musicking, something like that, I think.
Yeah. So it's communication, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a certain way, yes.
Mine is a bit different because I think, to me, the reason why I play the saxophone is because of the sound, and that sound that matches to myself. And I like to share that kind of sound that means something, rather than, that's the difference between noise and my music, or the music I want to share, is that it means something, it stands for something.
It's my belief that music is, it's not necessarily its own thing. It's the relationship we have with the sounds we hear that make it music. Someone might listen to music very third person. They might not be really listening to it, but it's there in the background. But then someone else might be listening to that same music and be very observant of it, knowing exactly what's happening in it. So I think music's about the relationship we have with the sounds, and even that decides what's music or not to us. It's very personal.
I love all the answers. I love all the different takes. I feel like it's like such a personal question. Like, it means something else to each one of us. Like, we all have our individual reasons. For example, like for me, it's not about the sound of the saxophone. Like, I feel like I could be playing a lot of different instruments. But the reason why Andy and I wanted to ask these two questions is because when we're practicing, we are often so confronted with what we can't do and what we have to practice and what doesn't work, that it tends to be sometimes a little bit difficult to remember why we're doing it, or to actually keep the overview of what we need to practice. So Andy and I did some brainstorming about this, what we need to practice. And we came up with one very fundamentally looking mind map. And then Andy has one that includes the mind and the ears and the body a little bit more. I started off with the question, what is music to me? And I thought music is expression, it's communication, and it's different characters. And that can be applied to different styles of music. But I thought this is like what I'm always looking for in pieces. I'm looking for the communicative part, what the composer is trying to tell me, and then what I need to share with the audience. And that led me to a group of 3 people. It's like one, the composer, and he comes from a certain period, whatever that period might be, and whatever the style might be. But it's something that we have to be aware of, because otherwise we don't know really what articulation and what vibrato to practice if we don't know what the style is or what he wants to say. Then we have the musician. There's a little part of us in there. And then we have the audience. Not during lockdown times in Germany, but ideally there are concerts and there is an audience. And so for me, music is taking the composer's ideas, the composer's expression, and sharing it through communication through my saxophone with the audience. So then I thought about what are the things that I can influence. So for me, I can add dynamic to the piece. There are always microdynamics that are not marked in the part that we are adding, that are an integral part to our phrasing. There's the color that we can choose, the vibrato that is not marked in the part and that we have to adjust to the style that we want to play. then there are written markings in there, and we talked about those a lot in recent talks, you know, like whether it's an articulation marking or it's a dynamic marking. We have to interpret it. We have to make something out of that. And that can be slightly different. You know, what does tenuto actually mean? Or how short is the staccato? And we don't need to go back to those. If you're interested in going back to those, you can listen to the old YouTube videos. They are vague information that we have to think about. And we don't have to just do, but we have to make sense of them and have to make sense how they work with our interpretation of the piece. Then there's the phrasing. So the phrasing goes with us thinking about what style we are in, and how we think the piece develops, how the sections develop. So it's a lot more complicated than just doing what's on the page. And then the last one is the articulation detail. What do the markings actually mean? Those are the things that I think a musician can influence. A lot of the other things, they are actually set by the composer. So the meter, the articulation, the rhythm, the style markings, you know, like the title of the piece sometimes, the intonation, all that is set. We have to do our best in interpreting what's on the page and go into the detail. And that's where these things come into play. A big part of actually being a musician or learning to be a musician or becoming better at being a musician is like increasing our knowledge of the composers that we are playing and of composers and musical styles in general. And the way we do that is that we don't only listen to the piece that we want to play, which, you know, there are advantages and disadvantages to listening to the piece that we want to play. But it also makes sense to listen to other works, other compositions of the same composer to figure out how the composer actually writes so that we get better at interpreting and finding out how the piece really is. We can also listen to other compositions from the same style or the same period, or composers from the same country, to just learn, you know, like what are the similarities, what are the differences, so that then we can bring out those differences. We play 5 different pieces in a program, you know, they are all different, and we need to learn to play them all in a different style. And then just in general, learn about the different styles that are around. So when you practice, you really have to keep all these things in mind and ask yourself what you want to be working on. And so always have a goal, always ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to fix? What is actually my problem? And then come back to the expression portion of it and figure out if you can actually communicate the composer's intent with your interpretation to the audience.
So as we were kind of talking about, the beginning, we had these kind of more philosophical responses. We're going into what does it mean to, as we are doing now as saxophone players, often we are interpreting a score if we're playing pre-composed music. And so we're coming from that direction. I wanted to go into what that means for me. I think for me, there's an element of connection with people to kind of go into that sort of more existential thing. And it's connecting with people through something that's maybe come from somebody else's mind, but it's doing so in a way that's coherent and that is in some way expressive and emotive, and is also mine, it's also me. And so my mind map kind of goes maybe more kind of experientially from the point of view of us as performers, or for me as a performer. And I think it also feeds into how I feel and what I do as a practicer, when I'm practicing, and also it touches on the lessons that I feel like I often need to communicate as a teacher, because, you know, we've all had this student, or maybe we've been the student. I certainly was the student who, you know, thought the faster I move my fingers and I'll just up one thing on the metronome each time, and that was practicing. But what happens is then you get these kind of maybe edgy and kind of uncommunicative performances. It's just all about playing faster. And I went at this from the point of view of what it feels to embody a piece of repertoire. The other thing that influences this is my own kind of just neural makeup. I'm somebody who's quite, or has been diagnosed as quite dyslexic. So for me, I don't trust my eyes and I don't trust text necessarily. And I certainly don't like, or my makeup doesn't like engaging with text in a time pressured situation. So my preparation is often about getting away from text and getting music into the mind and the body and the ears. And so these are the ways that I learn music. And incidentally, the ways that once I've learned this way, memorization is really pretty straightforward. So going to the ears, I start with the ears because it's music. Preparing and working through a piece of music, we need to hear the structure or direction of a phrase to understand it, to then understand the larger piece. Our ears are also going to take us into intonation, but also our ears are ways of getting knowledge in through listening to recordings. Hearing the phrase direction, I think, is particularly important. I will often start a phrase and I'll play through it. This is a trick I got from my doctoral teacher, Deborah Rickmeyer. You will put a pause, a fermata on every other note through the phrase and play from note to note with all these pauses. What it makes you do is play through, it connects your ear, but also as I'm preparing the phrase, I'll drop each fermata, the least interesting fermata, I'll drop it, and then I'll follow where my ears want to rest on a note. And the more I drop fermatas, I'll get to the end of it by the point where I've got maybe one left. And without even really knowing it, I've decided where the phrase goes to and away from and where it finishes, just through that process. It's also a process by which I've probably learned a lot of the technique. I'm connecting the notes nicely with my ear. And that's why I go in that direction. From that exercise, I understand the phrase in my ears by going through that process. And if I do that for every phrase, I'm a long way towards understanding the piece. Intonation is self-explanatory, and we've talked a lot about practicing with drones. I think that is very much as part of this. And we've covered recordings. So that's the ears for me. And then the body. So the other thing is we're making the sounds through the saxophone, but with the body, right? So we also have a physical sense of intonation. For me, I'll often feel the intonation in the voicing, so in back here where my soft palate and the back of my tongue are. And a lot of what preparing is you hear where you're in tune, you're playing with your drones or with tonal energy, then you've got to physically get to the point where I'm going to hit that altissimo note on the big jump in tune every time. What have I done? I've trained my ears, I'm training the body to make sure my voicing is in the right place. I'm training to make sure I'm not pushing the air too fast, which is going to drop my pitch, and so on. I also find I need a physical sense of the rhythm. I'll quite often practice rhythm away from the saxophone to get really physically get it in there, and also physically feeling where emphasis is. A gogic stress, I think, is really important for learning to phrase and learning to play. And I think the other thing is often when technique falls off, it's when rhythm and phrasing are not there with it. I find students all the time, the bit where they fall off their fingers is actually because they don't understand that there's a syncopation pulling them one way, or they don't hear expressively where the phrase is going. And then also finger technique is in there. For me, finger technique is a physically felt thing. I got over a lot of my issues with notation by just really practicing scales, to the point where I knew my body knew the scales, they knew patterns so well. It's a case of identifying those and being like, oh, okay, I don't need to read this. My body knows where that's going because I know it's an E major or arpeggio or whatever. And for me, all of those add together to create a physical sense of this music I'm making. And then for me, the other thing, I think I get a lot of intellectual stimulation out of practicing, and I think an engaged mind in practicing is really important, because I think, one, it makes it more meaningful, but two, I think analysis of a score as a performer, to know where it takes your physicality and where it takes your ears, is actually really useful. So I don't discount all the theory I've learned, but I spend quite a lot of time intellectually digging into a score from the point of view of how I'm going to play it. And I'll go into that more later when we do some examples from repertoire. But for example, analyzing technical content, it's kind of what I said. If I can look at like a mule study and I can find where all of those arpeggios I already know are, then all of a sudden it's much easier to kind of fly through it. Also, for example, analyzing the phrase structure often just confirms what my ears have told me by doing my process with fermatas. And then a large scale structural analysis, particularly for memorization, for me is really, really important. So going in to look at this whole thing makes these points about how these things interconnect. So my technical analysis informs my finger technique because I know the patterns I'm playing. I know they're in my body already because I learn my scales. Or the ears, the same thing. So my ears feeding into intonation, feeding into where I'm putting my voicing, you know, how I use the back of my tongue, understanding the whole piece. So again, analyzing that structural content, getting a whole understanding of it, and it takes you to the point, really, for me, that's when you become performance ready.
It just matters that you figure out over time how your brain works and what you need to get to that performance ready point. And there are a lot of, you know, like different approaches to that. For example, for me, practicing, it's really, really important that I set myself up for that. I need to have all the equipment ready to go that I need, including tuner and pencil or whatever, you know, like my iPad needs to be charged. I need to have peace of mind, you know, like, and I need my warm up to get my body and my mind in the same place. If I don't do those things, like I'm frantic, I'm not so concentrated, and I can't ask the right questions in my practice time, and therefore I'm wasting time. The older I get, one thing that gets more and more consistent is that I have less and less practice time. And so it just matters that you find what works for you. So when you've had a bad practice session, just ask yourself, what did you do? Did you practice goal-oriented? Did you know what you actually wanted to achieve in your practice session? Or were you just mindlessly stabbing away at trying to practice a couple runs? Or, you know, were you practicing the runs that you had trouble with yesterday the same way that you were practicing yesterday? And we all know that doesn't work because our brain shuts off. We, in fact, you know, like to keep our mind active, we need to practice as many different practice methods as we can to work around the problem and get rid of the problem that we have. And for that, we have to ask ourselves, what actually is the problem? You know, why can we not play a certain phrase? Or why can we not play a certain run? Or think about, okay, here it does not sound very good because I can't connect this large leap, and that's because my voicing isn't right. But if you just go over it and don't ask yourself what's wrong, then you can't fix it.
Yeah, and they say, what is it? They say that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is the definition of madness.